Ada for ignoring my dad when he says I love you and turning down his requests to connect with his daughter. When I, a woman now 33 years old, reflect on my childhood, I often find myself drawn back to the years when life was simple, yet quietly turbulent beneath the surface. Back then, when I was just a young girl of 10, life in our modest home seemed perfectly ordinary to anyone looking in from the outside. My father, a tall and charismatic man in his early 40s, carried himself with the kind of authority that made people trust him instantly. He had a way of walking into a room and commanding attention, whether he deserved it or not. My mother, on the other hand, was the epitome of grace. She was a woman with a quiet strength, always neatly dressed, her hair carefully pinned back, her demeanor exuding both intelligence and warmth. A qualified accountant by profession, she was more than capable of providing for herself, but she chose to devote her life to building our family, believing in the institution of marriage and the sacred vows she had once exchanged with my father. For a long time, I saw my parents through the innocent eyes of a child. My father was my hero, my protector, the man who could fix anything that was broken. My mother was my constant, the person who would wipe away my tears and hold me close when the world felt overwhelming. But children, as much as we like to believe they are shielded from the harsh realities of life, are often more perceptive than we give them credit for. And I, despite my young age, began to notice cracks in the carefully constructed facade of our family life. It started subtly. I remember overhearing whispered phone conversations late at night, my father's voice hushed yet urgent, the way he would step out of the room when the phone rang and return moments later with an air of agitation. At first, I didn't understand what it meant. I assumed he was dealing with something important, perhaps work-related, perhaps a matter he didn't want to worry my mother about. But as time went on, the signs became impossible to ignore. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the faint scent of perfume that wasn't my mother's clinging to his clothes. And then there were the arguments, quiet at first, muffled through closed doors, but growing louder and more frequent as the months passed. My mother, always composed and dignified, tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for my sake. She would set the table for dinner, her hands steady even as her eyes betrayed her weariness. She would help me with my homework, her voice gentle and encouraging, even though I could see the sadness lurking beneath her smiles. I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I knew that something was wrong. And then, one day, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was playing in my room when I heard my parents arguing downstairs. Their voices, usually restrained, were raised in anger. I crept to the top of the stairs, heart pounding in my chest, and listened. "How long do you think you can keep this up?" My mother's voice trembled with both fury and heartbreak. "Do you think I don't know? Do you think I haven't noticed?" My father's response was defensive, dismissive. "You're imagining things. Don't start this again." "I'm not imagining anything," my mother shot back. "I know there's someone else. I've known for a long time." There was a long silence, and in that moment, I held my breath, waiting for his denial, for some sort of reassurance that everything would be okay. But it never came. Instead, his silence spoke volumes, and my mother's quiet sobs cut through the air like a knife. That was the day I learned what infidelity meant, even if I didn't fully grasp the implications. My father, the man I had idolized, was cheating on my mother. And she knew. She had known for a long time but had chosen to stay with him, clinging to the hope that things might change, that he might return to being the man she had fallen in love with. As the years went by, the tension in our home grew more palpable. My mother's love for my father, once unwavering, became a source of both strength and pain. She stayed with him because she loved him, because she believed in the vows they had made, and because she wanted to keep our family together. But love, I would later learn, is not always enough to fix what is broken. It is not a cure-all for betrayal and heartache. My father's infidelities continued, and my mother endured it all with a resilience that I both admired and resented. I couldn't understand why she didn't leave him, why she chose to stay despite the humiliation and the pain. She was well educated, a woman with a respectable career. She didn't need him to survive. And yet, she stayed, holding on to the fragments of a marriage that had long since crumbled. By the time I turned 18, I was desperate to escape. I had watched my mother suffer in silence for too long, and I couldn't bear to be a part of that life anymore. I wanted a fresh start, a chance to build a life that wasn't overshadowed by my father's betrayals. So I made the decision to leave my country and pursue higher education abroad. It wasn't an easy decision leaving behind my mother, my home, everything I had ever known, but it felt like the only way to break free from the cycle of pain and disappointment. The day I boarded the plane was both liberating and heartbreaking. I remember standing at the airport, my mother by my side, her eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. She hugged me tightly, whispering words of encouragement, telling me how proud she was of me. But there was a sadness in her eyes, a deep-seated sorrow that I knew stemmed from more than just the pain of saying goodbye. She was losing a part of herself that day, the daughter she had raised with so much love and hope, now leaving in search of a better life. As I walked through the airport gates, I glanced back one last time. My mother stood there, a solitary figure in the bustling crowd, waving at me with a bittersweet smile. And then, as I turned away, I caught sight of my father standing in the distance. He hadn't come to say goodbye. He hadn't offered me words of encouragement or support. Instead, he stood there with a suitcase in hand, his eyes fixed on the horizon, ready to walk away from the life he had built. It wasn't until later that I learned the full extent of what had happened after I left. The moment I got onto that plane, my father packed up his bags and left my mother in the house, abandoning her once and for all. He didn't leave her with peace or closure. Instead, he left her with his relatives, people who had enabled his behavior for years, expecting her to take care of them as if it were her duty. It was an act of cruelty disguised as indifference, a final betrayal in a long line of betrayals. And where did my father go? He went to live with another woman, a woman he had been seeing for some time. The cycle repeated itself, as it always does with men like him. He started a new life with her, but even that, it seemed, was not enough to satisfy him. He cheated on her too, just as he had cheated on my mother. And they had a child together, a daughter born 6 years ago, a child who would grow up never knowing the extent of her father's sins. Looking back, I wonder how my mother found the strength to endure it all. How she managed to hold her head high, even as the world crumbled around her. She deserved so much more than the life she was given, so much more than the man who betrayed her trust. And yet, she remained steadfast, a pillar of strength in the face of adversity. As for me, I vowed to never let myself be trapped in the same cycle of pain and betrayal. I left my country not just to pursue an education, but to reclaim my life, to forge a path that was entirely my own. And though the scars of my past remain, I carry them as a reminder of the strength it takes to walk away, to choose oneself over the ties that bind. Time moved forward, as it always does, indifferent to the wreckage left behind by human choices. I had built a life for myself far from the shadows of my childhood, carving out a space in a foreign land where I could finally breathe without the weight of my past pressing down on me. My focus was on growth, personal, professional, and emotional. I worked hard, poured myself into my education, and eventually secured a good job, one that allowed me to live comfortably and with dignity. The scars of my upbringing remained, but I learned to coexist with them, wearing them like invisible armor. The world didn't need to know about the battles I had fought to get to where I was. It was enough that I knew. By the time I reached my early 30s, I had not only built a stable life for myself but had also taken steps to ensure my mother was well cared for. I couldn't undo the years of pain she had endured, but I could give her a semblance of the peace and security she had always deserved. I bought her a modest house, nothing extravagant, but a place she could truly call her own, a place untouched by my father's lingering presence. I made sure she had a car, too, so she could regain a sense of independence. Seeing her smile, truly smile, for the first time in years was a gift I cherished. It felt like redemption, as if I were reclaiming something that had been stolen from us both. For years, I kept my contact with my father minimal. The terms were clear. I would only speak to him if it concerned his health. I had no interest in the details of his personal life, his relationships, or his other children. Those were boundaries I had set firmly when I boarded that plane at 18, and I intended to uphold them. Yet, as time passed, his attempts to encroach upon those boundaries grew more persistent. It started with sporadic phone calls, brief, obligatory exchanges that left me feeling drained. He would ask how I was doing, inquire about my work, but it always felt superficial. There was no depth, no sincerity. It was as if he were trying to preserve a connection he had long since severed through his actions. Then, 2 years ago, my phone rang late one evening. It was unusual for him to call at that hour, and I debated whether to answer. Against my better judgment, I picked up, bracing myself for whatever request he was about to make. His voice, once commanding and confident, now sounded tired, worn down by the passage of time and, perhaps, by his own regrets. "The woman I've been living with, she's not well," he said, his tone subdued. I remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "She has cancer," he finally revealed, the words hanging heavily in the air. I felt a strange mix of emotions: surprise, pity, resentment. The woman he had left my mother for, the woman who had willingly built a life with a man who had a history of betrayal, was now facing her mortality. There was a certain poetic justice in it, though I couldn't bring myself to revel in someone else's suffering. Still, I couldn't ignore the irony. Life, it seemed, had finally caught up with my father. "She needs treatment," he continued, and that's when the true purpose of his call became clear. "I don't have the money to cover it." I clenched my jaw, anger bubbling beneath the surface. After everything he had done, after all the pain he had caused, he had the audacity to ask me for money to help the very woman he had chosen over our family? The nerve of it was almost laughable. But there was no humor in the situation, only the bitter taste of old wounds reopening. "I'm asking for help," he added, his voice breaking slightly, as if he were trying to evoke sympathy. I wanted to refuse. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to hang up the phone, to remind him that he had forfeited any right to ask for my help the moment he walked out on us. But then I thought of my mother. Despite everything, she had always taught me to be compassionate, to rise above the pettiness of grudges and hatred. And deep down, I knew I wasn't doing it for him or for that woman. I was doing it to honor the values my mother had instilled in me. "I'll send the money," I said curtly, already regretting my decision. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, grappling with the conflicting emotions swirling within me. I convinced myself that the money wasn't for her, it was for him. He was still my father, after all, even if our relationship was fractured beyond repair. I tried to rationalize it, to make peace with my choice, but the bitterness lingered. Months passed, and I heard little from him. Then, one day, he called again. "She's gone," he said simply. The woman he had left everything for, the woman he had abandoned his family to be with, had succumbed to her illness. There was no sorrow in his voice, no sign of mourning. It was as if he were merely reporting a fact, another chapter closed in his tumultuous life. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me felt a strange sense of closure, not for her death, but for the chapter of my life that she represented. She was a symbol of my father's betrayal, and now that symbol was gone. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of another chapter, one that would bring new challenges and new wounds. "I thought you should know," he added before ending the call. After that, he started reaching out more frequently. His calls became a regular occurrence, each one leaving me more drained than the last. It wasn't long before he began to bring up his other child, his 6-year-old daughter, the the product of his relationship with the woman who had passed away. "She's been asking about you," he said one day, his tone hopeful. "I tell her stories about her big sister." I froze at his words. Big sister? The term felt foreign, almost alien. I didn't see myself as anyone's sister, especially not to a child I had never met, a child born out of a relationship that had caused so much pain. I had no emotional connection to her, no desire to play a role in her life. And yet, my father continued to push the narrative, weaving a tale of sibling bonds that existed only in his mind. "She wants to meet you," he said softly, as if testing the waters. "No," I replied firmly, without hesitation. He tried to persuade me, to appeal to my sense of compassion. But I stood my ground. I had made it clear from the start I wanted no part in his personal life, no involvement with his other children or relationships. My boundaries were non-negotiable. Weeks later, he brought it up again. "She keeps asking about you," he said. "She wants to know her sister." I felt the resentment simmering beneath the surface. Why was he so insistent? Why was he trying to force a connection that I had no interest in forming? The more he pushed, the more I began to suspect his motives. He was in his 60s now, no longer the strong, self-assured man he once was. Age had caught up with him, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking for someone to take responsibility for his daughter, someone with a stable job and a steady life. And who better than the daughter he had abandoned all those years ago? The thought made my blood boil. I wasn't a fool. I saw through his attempts to manipulate me, to guilt me into taking on a burden that wasn't mine to bear. I had worked too hard to build the life I had, to break free from the chains of my past. I wasn't about to let him drag me back into the chaos. A few days ago, he tried again. This time, he was drunk. His voice slurred. He rambled on about love and family, words that felt hollow coming from him. "I love you," he said, the words hanging awkwardly in the air. Where I come from, those words aren't spoken lightly. Love is shown through actions, through loyalty and sacrifice. My father's actions had never aligned with the words he now spoke. I stared at him, unmoved, and changed the subject. But the resentment remained. It sat heavy in my chest, a constant reminder of the wounds he had inflicted. And though I knew the 6-year-old girl was innocent in all of this, I couldn't bring myself to care. She was a product of his choices, his betrayals. She wasn't my responsibility. As I reflect on it all, I can't help but wonder, am I the asshole? Perhaps. But after a lifetime of pain and disappointment, I've learned to prioritize my own peace. And that, I believe, is not something I owe anyone an apology for. When I left my country at the age of 18, it wasn't just a physical departure. It was a severing of ties, a deliberate step away from the toxic environment that had shaped my formative years. Before boarding that plane, I made it clear to my father that our relationship would only continue on my terms. I was no longer the naive child who believed in the fairy tale of an unbreakable bond between parent and child. I had seen the cracks, lived through the fractures, and I knew better than to set myself up for more heartbreak. I told him plainly that I would not concern myself with the tangled mess of his personal life, not his women, not his children, not even the relatives who had stood by silently as he tore our family apart. The only reason I would ever pick up the phone or respond to his messages would be if it concerned his health. That was the boundary I established, the thin thread that kept our connection from snapping entirely. At first, he seemed to understand. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince me otherwise. Perhaps he thought I would soften over time, that the distance would make me nostalgic for home and, by extension, for him. But I knew better. I knew that time and distance wouldn't erase the pain of betrayal, wouldn't rewrite the past. If anything, it solidified my resolve. The years passed, and our interactions became transactional. He would call or text, always with a request for money. It was never phrased as a demand, always couched in terms of need. He needed help with bills, with repairs, with medical expenses. Each time, I found myself torn between duty and resentment. On one hand, he was still my father. The man who had once held my hand as I learned to walk, who had kissed my forehead before bedtime. On the other hand, he was the man who had destroyed our family, who had abandoned my mother without a second thought, who had chosen his selfish desires over his responsibilities time and time again. I sent him money, begrudgingly, telling myself that I was fulfilling a basic obligation. I wasn't doing it out of love or respect, but out of a sense of moral duty. It was easier to justify it that way. I convinced myself that I wasn't enabling him, that I was simply helping someone in need. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was a part of me that wondered if I was still seeking his approval, if I was trying to prove that, despite everything, I had turned out better than he ever expected. Each time he reached out, the same pattern repeated itself. He would start with small talk, asking how I was, how my job was going, whether I had plans to visit home. And then, inevitably, the conversation would shift. There was always a reason he needed money, always a story that painted him as a victim of circumstance. It was infuriating. He never acknowledged the pain he had caused, never took responsibility for his actions. It was as if he lived in a world where the past didn't exist, where he was entitled to forgiveness without ever having asked for it. I learned to detach myself emotionally from these interactions. I treated them like business transactions, impersonal, efficient, devoid of sentiment. But every once in a while, something would slip through the cracks. A comment, a tone of voice, a reference to the past. And I would feel that familiar pang of anger and hurt, a reminder of wounds that had never fully healed. One particular conversation stands out in my memory. It was a rainy evening, and I had just finished a long day at work. My phone buzzed with a message from him. I already knew what it would be about before I even opened it. He needed money, again. "Can you help me out this month? Things are tight," the message read. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenched. It was always the same story. No matter how much I sent, it was never enough. He never seemed to get back on his feet, never seemed to take responsibility for his own life. And yet, I found myself typing a response, agreeing to send him the money. The cycle continued. But this time, he added something that stopped me in my tracks. "By the way, I've been thinking a lot about the past. I know I wasn't the best father. I made mistakes." I froze, rereading the words. It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever received from him. But even then, it felt hollow, incomplete. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't acknowledge the pain he had caused my mother and me. It was a vague statement, a half-hearted attempt at redemption. I didn't respond to that part of his message. I sent the money and left it at that. I wasn't ready to open that door, to revisit the past he had so carelessly destroyed. As the months went by, his requests became more frequent. And with each request, my resentment grew. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the unspoken expectations, the way he seemed to think he could waltz back into my life and pick up where we had left off. As if nothing had happened. As if the years of pain and silence could be erased with a few texts and wire transfers. One day, after yet another request for money, I finally snapped. "Do you ever stop to think about what you've done?" I texted back, my fingers trembling with anger. "Do you ever think about the consequences of your actions? Or do you just expect everyone to clean up your messes?" There was a long pause before he replied. "I'm trying to be better," he wrote. "I know I've made mistakes, but I want to make things right." It was infuriating. He still didn't get it. Making things right wasn't about sending me messages or trying to reconnect. It was about taking responsibility, about acknowledging the pain he had caused and making amends. And yet, despite my anger, I couldn't bring myself to cut him off completely. There was still a part of me that clung to the hope that he might change, that he might finally understand the impact of his actions. But deep down, I knew better. People don't change unless they truly want to. And my father had never shown any real desire to change. He was still the same man who had walked out on his family without a second thought, still the same man who prioritized his own desires over everything else. The turning point came a few months later, when he called me out of the blue. His voice was softer than usual, almost tentative. "I need to talk to you," he said. "What is it now?" I asked, already bracing myself for another request. "It's about your sister." I felt a chill run down my spine. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. I didn't have a sister. Not in the way that mattered. "She's been asking about you," he continued. "She wants to meet you." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. This wasn't the first time he had brought her up. Each time, I had shut him down firmly, making it clear that I had no interest in forming a relationship with her. She was his child, a product of his choices. She wasn't my responsibility. "I told you before," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not interested." "She's innocent in all of this," he said softly. "She doesn't know anything about the past. She just wants to know her big sister." I felt a surge of anger rise within me. "And whose fault is that?" I shot back. "You created this situation. You made these choices. Don't try to push your responsibilities onto me." There was silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, I wondered if he had hung up. But then he spoke again, his voice trembling. "I just thought, maybe you'd want to know her. She's a good kid." I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. "I'm not going to be your backup plan," I said firmly. "I'm not going to clean up your messes." And with that, I ended the call. It was a painful decision, but it was necessary. I had spent too many years carrying the weight of his mistakes. It was time to let go, to focus on my own peace and well-being. The past would always be a part of me, but I refused to let it define my future. As I put my phone down, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. For the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my own narrative. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could give myself. Fast forward to 6 months ago, and things began to shift again, slowly but unmistakably. My father started calling more frequently. At first, it was settled. The conversations followed the same pattern they always had: small talk, questions about my job, and eventually a request for money. But something about his tone had changed. He sounded older, more tired, and there was a new desperation in his voice, a kind of vulnerability I wasn't used to hearing from him. I could tell he was circling around something he wanted to bring up but wasn't sure how to approach. And then, finally, he did. "She keeps asking about you," he said one day, seemingly out of nowhere. I blinked in confusion. "Ooh. Your sister." Those words again. My sister. A 6-year-old girl I had never met and had no desire to meet. A child who, through no fault of her own, had become a symbol of everything I had fought to leave behind. I felt my chest tighten with anger, frustration, and a twinge of guilt I wasn't ready to fully acknowledge. "She's always asking about her big sister," he continued, his voice softening, as if he thought this would make a difference. "I tell her stories about you. She knows your name. She wants to meet you." My hands clenched into fists. I could feel my pulse quickening, a familiar tension building in my body. This wasn't the first time he had tried to bring her into the conversation, and each time, I had shut it down firmly. My boundaries were clear, and I had no intention of moving them for him or for anyone. "No," I said, my voice cold and resolute. He paused, clearly taken aback by my tone. "I thought you might want to meet her. She's a good kid. She's innocent in all this." "Innocent?" The word echoed in my mind, stirring something uncomfortable within me. Yes, she was innocent. She hadn't asked to be born into this mess. She hadn't caused the pain my mother and I had endured. But that didn't change the fact that I didn't want to be a part of her life. I didn't want to be dragged back into the chaos my father had created. I told you before, I said sharply. I'm not interested. Stop bringing her up. There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought he might finally drop the subject. But my father was nothing if not persistent. He couldn't help himself. A few weeks later, he tried again. She really wants to meet you, he said one evening. Maybe we could have dinner? Just the three of us. No, I said immediately. Absolutely not. He sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. Why not? She's your sister. She's not my sister, I snapped. She's your child. Your responsibility. Don't try to make her my problem. The words came out harsher than I intended, but I didn't regret them. I knew what he was trying to do. He was laying the groundwork, planting the seeds of guilt and obligation. He was in his 60s now, no longer the strong, confident man I remembered from my childhood. He was aging, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was looking for someone to take on the burden he could no longer carry. He was looking for me. And I wasn't having it. The more he brought her up, the more suspicious I became. It wasn't just about introducing me to his daughter. It was about finding someone with a stable life and a decent job, someone who could step in and take care of her when he no longer could. The thought made my stomach churn. I wasn't a sucker. I wasn't going to let him manipulate me into becoming a surrogate parent for a child I had no connection to. But the guilt lingered, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. I knew the girl was innocent. She hadn't done anything to deserve my coldness, my refusal to meet her. And yet, every time I thought about her, all I could see was my mother's face. My mother, who had endured years of betrayal and heartbreak. My mother, who had sacrificed so much to give me a better life. Meeting this child, this living, breathing reminder of my father's choices felt like a betrayal to her memory. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. Then, a few days ago, he called again. This time, he was drunk. His words were slurred, his sentences disjointed, but the message was clear. She really wants to meet you, he said, his voice cracking. She talks about you all the time. She loves you, even though she's never met you. I felt a lump form in my throat, but I swallowed it down, refusing to let the emotion take hold. I love you, he added suddenly, the words hanging awkwardly in the air. I froze. Love wasn't something we said in my family. It wasn't something we expressed openly or easily. My father had never said those words to me before. Hearing them now, in his drunken state, felt jarring, almost surreal. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want to respond. We don't do that where I come from. I just stared at the phone in silence, waiting for him to sober up or change the subject. When he realized I wasn't going to reciprocate, he shifted the conversation, rambling on about mundane topics until the call finally ended. After I hung up, I sat in silence, my mind racing. There was a lot of resentment there, more than I cared to admit. Resentment toward my father for everything he had done, resentment toward the girl for existing, resentment toward myself for feeling so conflicted. But at the core of it all was a simple truth. I didn't want to be pulled back into my father's life. I had spent years building my own life, creating distance from the chaos of my past. I wasn't about to let him drag me back in. And yet, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe I was being unfair. Maybe I was punishing an innocent child for the sins of her father. Maybe I was closing myself off to a potential relationship that could bring healing and closure. But I couldn't bring myself to care. Not enough to change my stance. The thought lingered, haunting me in quiet moments. Was I being the asshole? Was I wrong for refusing to meet this child? I wrestled with the question, turning it over in my mind, searching for an answer that would bring me peace. But no matter how I framed it, I always came back to the same conclusion: no. I wasn't the asshole. I had every right to protect myself, to set boundaries that kept me safe. I wasn't responsible for cleaning up my father's messes. I wasn't obligated to play the role of big sister to a child I had never met. I thought of my mother, her quiet strength, her unwavering resilience. She had endured so much, sacrificed so much, all for the sake of love and family. And what had it brought her? Heartache, betrayal, loneliness. I couldn't follow in her footsteps. I couldn't allow myself to be drawn into the same cycle of pain and disappointment. My father made his choices. He lived his life on his terms, without regard for the consequences. And now, he was facing those consequences. It wasn't my job to save him. It wasn't my job to step in where he had failed. I am no sucker. As for the little girl, she would grow up knowing the truth one day. She would come to understand the kind of man her father was. And maybe, just maybe, she would learn to rise above it, to carve out her own path, free from the shadows of his mistakes. But that wasn't my responsibility. My life was my own, and I intended to keep it that way. The story of my family was one of brokenness, betrayal, and survival. And while I carried the scars of that story, I refused to let it define me. I would not be his backup plan. I would not betray my mother's memory. And if that made me the asshole, so be it.